currently, the Russian forces are pursuing several offensive operations throughout the front line, namely focusing on Donetsk Oblast with the objective of capturing the entirety of the region and completing the occupation of Luhansk Oblast as well. The Russians are also pursuing some limited offensive operations in Zaporizhia Oblast, namely to regain some of the previously lost positions that they had that Ukrainian forces liberated over the summer. I think the most important things to observe right now is the Russian operations in Chasiv Yar direction, which is west of Bakhmut. We've all probably heard about the battle for Bakhmut last year, which resulted in significant casualties for the Russians. It took them a year to essentially restart that offensive campaign, and now they're trying to advance towards Chasiv Yar. Russians are making incremental gains throughout the front line, mostly, like I've said, in Donetsk Oblast. However, this is all because Ukrainian forces do not have sufficient material to defend. In the past, we have seen how Ukrainian forces were able to exhaust and culminate Russian forces, specifically after the battles of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in summer 2022, or the battle for Bakhmut last year. Ukrainians don't have enough material to do and exert that same level of exhaustion onto Russian forces, which is why we see tactical gains on the front line. I have some data for you if you're interested. So since April 1 of this year, the Russians gained around 19 square kilometers, which is not a substantial amount of territory. However, tactical gains are still important in the context of lack of Ukrainian material. And then since January 1, Russian forces seized around 360 square kilometers across the entirety of the front line.
Kateryna, you mentioned Chasiv Yar in Donetsk Oblast. Can you just explain to us why the Russian forces are after taking that town and what it would mean to their strategy?
Of course. So the offensive effort to seize Chasiv Yar offers Russian forces the most immediate prospects for an operationally significant advances in the area, namely because it allows Russian forces to threaten Ukrainian stronghold of the strong fortress that Ukrainians have built in Donetsk Oblast, which is tied between several settlements called Slavyansk, Drushkivka, Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk. Those are the areas that Ukrainian forces were able to fortify throughout the 8 years of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And an advance to Chasiv Yar, while the capture of the settlement itself is not nearly as important as the prospects of the Russians being able to advance forward. Whether the Russians decide to threaten these strongholds is one thing, but the Russians can also go after interdicting Ukrainian logistic lines, which would make the defense of Donetsk Oblast, the remainder of Donetsk Oblast, very challenging for Ukrainian forces that are focusing their defensive positions on those settlements that I mentioned earlier. Chasiv Yar is something that we really need to watch closely. This is the worst case scenario forecast. Obviously, this is not something that is happening currently. The Russians have not seized Chasiv Yar at this point. If they do try to seize Chasiv Yar, it will likely not be a rapid advance because Ukrainian forces are defending these positions pretty closely, and because of the geographical challenges that the Russians might face in the settlement. Namely, there's a canal that goes through Chasiv Yar on the eastern side of the settlement, as well as there are some heights. We cannot forecast whether it's going to fall or not. This is ultimately a Ukraine decision and Ukraine's ability to have enough material to defend. However, it is important to consider all possible forecasts, which also includes, the possibility of Russians capturing the settlement and trying to advance further after a certain time period.
In your view, then, if they were to take this settlement, then that would be a significant step towards taking over the whole of Donetsk.
I mean, of course, it's going to take them a lot of time and effort. We have seen that the Russians, it took them a year to restart offensive operations after culminating in Bakhmut. But I think a big factor in this is Ukraine's ability to defend. Like I mentioned, Ukrainians are suffering from material shortages. This is going to have a significant impact as Ukraine needs to exhaust these forces to stop them from advancing forward. If Ukraine receives that material and also fixes its manpower issues through the recent mobilization law, then, in fact, the Russians might not be able to threaten these positions, or the stronghold conglomeration that Ukrainians have formed at a later time, right? But this is all currently very much in the air, given that we don't know how much material Ukraine is going to get and whether Ukraine even gets material from the US. And so that I'll probably leave it at that.
Yeah, I have a question coming up on the US aid to Ukraine in a moment. Just to turn, though, to some analysis by BBC Russian, they say the Russian death toll has now passed the 50,000 mark, with the number of casualties 25% higher in the second 12 months than in the first year. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, absolutely. It is around that time we saw the resumption of Russian offensive operations, namely the painful battle for Bakhmut, as well as their assaults on Vuhledar in February of 2023. So all of those is pretty correlated to what we are seeing in the battlefield. Russians also suffered significant losses when they tried to resume offensive operations on Avdiivka in fall of 2023 as well.
Could you just put that number into context for us? I mean, how does the loss of 50,000 troops compare to World Wars One and Two, the Vietnam, Korean Wars at this point in the conflict?
So the Russian losses are significantly larger than what they have experienced in, say, Afghanistan, for example. I'm not sure how they compare in terms of the numbers for World War One or Two or Vietnam, but we know that the Russians are suffering a lot more losses than what they had recently as of Afghanistan war, or I believe also as their losses during Chechen wars. Um, those numbers are likely larger too than just 50,000. This is only what BBC and Mediazona were able to confirm by looking at pictures of graves or, obituaries online. So the Russian losses are likely larger than this. And we know this based on also US assessments and Western assessments of the Russian losses. I don't remember the number at the top of my head. However, there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of calculating losses when monitoring war.
And the 25% increase in death rate in the second year of the war is being attributed to a so-called meat grinder strategy. Can you just explain what that is exactly?
Yeah, so a meat grinder strategy is when Russian units essentially they dismount their light infantry, so their combat vehicles, bring them up to the front lines or any type of transportation, and these infantry units they conduct rapid assaults without mechanized equipment. They don't have combat vehicles, so they are essentially going by and running through fields to attack Ukrainian positions. The strategy behind this is that it's not just a one-time assault, right? So they don't just run one time and then that's it. This is so that the overwhelming number of fighters attack at a constant rate to overpower Ukrainian forces, to force Ukrainians in trenches or on the positions on the ground, essentially to be in under constant pressure, and which is it results in significant losses for Russian forces. We have seen the rates of casualties around Bakhmut, especially for Wagner Group, which was the lead in those human wave assaults around that time, or with prisoner units that were also leading these efforts in 2023. So the idea is to overpower Ukrainian forces with the sheer amount of manpower. This is not great for if you want to retain your manpower because, as I mentioned, it does lead to significant casualties. However, tactical ground gains that these forces can achieve by daily several assaults that they launch can lead to Russians kind of developing this sequence of tactical gains that lead to eventual breakthrough after many, many months, which is exactly what happened with Wagner. It took them from October to May, which is when they claimed that they started the offensive on Bakhmut, to finally capture the city, and it lost them a lot of forces.
And where else have the heaviest losses been using this tactic, and where has it been most effective apart from Bakhmut in terms of territorial gains? And can you just give us an idea of how widely it's being used right now?
Yeah, so we have seen similar attacks on Severodonetsk and Lysychansk when that was going on in summer of 2022. The Russians did effectively win those settlements, those cities, and then after that they were unable to advance further, which is why we're seeing that side of the front line pretty dormant, with occasional offensive operations, part of occasional assaults occurring here and there. Now, the Russians have changed their tactics recently. They're experimenting with launching mechanized assaults of platoon or company size. So essentially, they used a couple of armored vehicles or even tanks to try to advance with a smaller number of personnel. Um, we are seeing that take place mostly in Chasiv direction as well as in the Avdiivka direction. And that is to mixed results. We obviously do see that the Russians are taking losses in their military equipment. So a lot of Ukrainian drone footage shows Ukrainian forces using FPV drones, the first person view drones, to disable some of Russian armored equipment. The degree to which they destroy that equipment is challenging to say from videos, obviously, because destroying a tank, for example, is a very challenging task, especially with a drone or without artillery. So as of now, they've changed their tactics. They are trying and experimenting with different composition of forces. So in the past, we've seen the Russian use battalion-sized mechanized assaults, but then since that decreased, and now they returned to company and platoon-sized mechanized assaults in the Donetsk Oblast.
Zelensky is right, and the explanations being given as to why he didn't receive that assistance are very poor. I think the U.S. And the West as a whole has not given assistance to Ukraine in a comprehensive strategic fashion. We've dribbled it out over 2 years. At whatever levels we've given, Britain has been in the forefront. The U.S. has lagged behind. But let's just take one of the early questions that came up about air power for Ukraine. Poland asked if the U.S. would object if Poland sent its Russian-derived MiG fighter planes to Ukraine in the very early days of the war. Secretary of State Blinken said on one of our Sunday talk shows we would support that request, and he was overruled. There's only one person who can overrule it. And Ukraine, to this day, 2 years later, still does not have adequate air capability and obviously does not have defense. What are the Russians firing at? Civil power stations to harm Ukraine's economy and its civilian population. I could go through a long list of weapon systems that we've debated one after the other, agonizingly slowly, and then finally deliver them again in a piecemeal fashion. People say the war is gridlocked. Ukraine doesn't have a war to winning. At the moment, it is gridlocked. But one critical reason for that is the inadequate strategic thinking of the assistance we've given them.
The current crisis, you could argue, with Israel and Iran has injected energy into the stalled US aid package for Ukraine and Israel. We now know it will be voted on in the coming days. House Speaker Mike Johnson has said, we have to do the right thing and history will judge. What's changed?
Well, I think Speaker Johnson has risen to the occasion. I don't think he ever expected to be Speaker of the House. When Kevin McCarthy was ousted 5 months or so ago. I think he's found his voice, though, and he knows your listeners may not be aware his job is on the line. Opponents of aid to Ukraine, who are many of them spouting Russian propaganda, literally, have threatened to oust him from the speakership. There's a very narrow Republican majority. It's a couple of votes. There are a number of vacancies. The aid package may succeed or fail on Saturday. We don't know. I think if it gets a open vote on the House floor, it will pass. But Speaker Johnson may face what's called a motion to vacate to oust him from the speakership. He's going ahead with it anyway. that is doing the right thing. We should support the Ukrainians. I hope that package passes, and I hope the speaker remains the speaker. He is demonstrating real courage against a group of people who are ill-informed at best and succumbing to Russian propaganda at worst. It's a real disgrace.
Every time the West has been considering bolstering support for Ukraine, President Putin finds a way of trying to scare the West off with a nuclear threat. Has Iran, do you think, been emboldened by this? And how soon before it poses itself a serious nuclear threat?
Well, I think Iran could be a nuclear threat within about 72 hours if it simply wires the appropriate amount of purchase money to the central bank of North Korea and Pyongyang and get a couple warheads loaded on transports that would fly across China and deliver them to Iran. Look, we're facing a new axis that's in the process of formation. It's not completely done yet, but the Beijing-Moscow axis is real. It's got its outliers like North Korea and Iran and Syria, Belarus, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. They're all on the same side. Iranian drones are being used by Russia in Ukraine right now. And I think the weakness the West has displayed, the ineffectiveness we've displayed in Ukraine, very visible in Moscow, very visible in Beijing, and in all the capitals that we fear. So we either get our act together again and face this challenge, or we're just going to see Ukraine and the war in the Middle East repeated elsewhere, in Asia in particular, where I'm now worried.
On that note, how do you think the forthcoming presidential election result in the US will determine future global security and, of course, that of NATO?
Well, I don't think either Joe Biden or Donald Trump are fit to be president. I think it's going to be a bad 4 years for the United States, whoever wins. But I would just say, with respect to Trump, I think he's very serious about getting out of NATO. I think that would be a catastrophic mistake for the United States. But those who say, oh, he's just bargaining with the Europeans, he's just trying to get their defense spending up to 2% of GDP, all I can say is from 17 months of personal experience, that's not what he's doing. I and probably thousands of other Americans over the years have pleaded with our friends in Europe to spend more on defense because we wanted to strengthen NATO. Trump criticizes those who don't make the target, not to strengthen NATO, but to give himself a ground to withdraw from it.
Just to return to where we started in this talk, we are at a point where Israel has not retaliated. We don't know exactly what it's going to do. What do you think is at stake here in terms of the way it reacts? How can this determine the future in terms of the stability of the Middle East and the way Iran will proceed?
The question is whether Israel wants to manage the problem of Iran or wants to try and solve the problem of Iran. I'd say it's sort of an American way of thinking that we don't manage problems, we solve them. The biggest threat to peace and security in the Middle East today is Iran, its nuclear program and its support for terrorism. Israel is the principal target. It's the little Satan that Iran talks about and whose nuclear program is, I think, devoted to destroying Israel. If Israel acts dispositively here, it will do itself and the world a favor. I don't know what the Israeli decision is, but I think the United States should support this, one of its strongest allies, as it acts against an existential threat posed by Iran. Attack from the territory of Iran onto the territory of Israel. So cutting through all the use of terrorist proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria as part of the Iranian Ring of Fire strategy, this was a direct Iranian attack. And I think that fully justifies an Israeli response. I think those who in the days and hours after the Saturday attack were saying things like President Biden, take the win, or just fundamentally wrong. It's not a win to remain alive. And when particularly Israel worries about the existential threat of an Iranian nuclear weapons program, I think that should be a major factor in their decision to retaliate. At a minimum, what happened on Saturday was the failure of deterrence. And so the first question for Israel is how to restore deterrence. I don't believe you restore it with a group of medieval religious fanatics ruling a country like Iran by proportional response, tit for tat. It simply says to them, we know exactly what the response will be if we were to do it again. You reestablish deterrence by disproportionate force. Make it clear to the adversary that if they ever try anything like that again, they will suffer far more than any cost they impose on Israel, meaning if they're sensible, if they have any kind of logic comparable to ours, they won't risk it again. And that's what Israel should be aiming at.
And Iran has preempted Israel's response by threatening that even the tiniest invasion of its territory would bring a massive and harsh response, and that if Iran had wanted to carry out a bigger attack on Saturday, it would have done, and nothing would have remained of the Zionist regime. What do you think their intention was?
Well, I think that kind of rhetoric derives from Kim Jong-un's playbook in North Korea. He routinely announces he's going to unleash a sea of fire across the Korean peninsula if anybody looks at him cross-eyed. Um, this is from a regime that says it doesn't want nuclear weapons, that it's not pursuing them covertly, and yet it's using that kind of language. That's the language of a regime that, unfortunately, for all concerned, its people, Israel's people, the rest of the world, unfortunately, only respects force. And the way to demonstrate that force is right at hand now with a very strong Israeli response. Is there risk in a strong Israeli response? Of course. But there's graver risk, I think, in not responding, given Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons.
But what do you think Iran's intention was?
Well, we know that this was an unprecedented effort by Iran to attack another country. They've never done anything quite like this before. They used cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones. So it was trying to show their overall capability. I don't think this was a kabuki theater exercise. I think they expected to inflict significant damage. And one fact that hasn't gotten much attention, which I think is important, reported by the Wall Street Journal on Saturday and by CBS reporting separately on Wednesday, informed by American sources that of the 120 ballistic missiles that Iran launched out of the total of 320 projectiles Saturday night, of the 120 ballistic missiles, half blew up on the launch pad or crashed to earth before they got close enough to Israel to shoot down. Now, if that's correct, a failure rate of 50% of their ballistic missiles tells us something about their capabilities. You don't play act at going after Israel when you're going to be embarrassed by the fact that half your ballistic missiles were junk. So I think it demonstrates the seriousness of Iran's intention and the weakness of their ballistic missile arsenal.
The US and the UK are all about not escalating, but is the risk of a greater regional war a risk you simply have to take at this moment?
Israel's in a regional war. That's what the ring of fire strategy is. And obviously, decision makers have to calibrate risk against a reward here. What do they expect to get? What do they fear might happen later? There is a risk in retaliating. Nobody can deny that. There's also a risk in not retaliating, in saying to Iran that, in effect, Israel is intimidated by Iran or has succumbed to U.S. pressure. This goes to one of the most important and least well-known things Winston Churchill ever said when he talked about the confirmed unteachability of mankind, of our unwillingness to act when the cost of action is minimal, only to face the problem down the road where you have to act and the cost and the risks are much higher. I come back again to the Iranian nuclear weapons program. No one in Israel can have any faith that the next time they see incoming ballistic missiles from Iran, they may have nuclear warheads under their nose cones.
Iran was retaliating, it says, to the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate building in Syria. Do you think that attack was justified?
Well, it took out several senior Quds Force officials who are the people responsible for Iraq and Syria who have been transporting Iranian drones and missiles across Iraq and Syria into Lebanon to go into Hezbollah's arsenal. They were directing part of the Ring of Fire strategy. That entitles Israel to go after them. They are combatants. It's true they were apparently in a consulate, but that doesn't shield them as they're carrying on military activity. You can go into a church or you can go into an office building and put a cross on the front door. That doesn't mean it's a religious facility. It's being used for military purposes.
Yeah, I suppose, first of all, if you could just give me your assessment of what we've seen over the last few days.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, on Saturday, April 13th, Iran launched hundreds of drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles targeting Israel. Several ballistic missiles impacted near a few Israeli military bases. So the Iranians were not targeting civilian sites, but rather military targets.
How well did the Iron Dome, the much vaunted Iron Dome of Israel, cope?
Well, it's hard to tell exactly how well the Iron Dome coped, but I think it's important to note that the Israeli air defenses are more than just the Iron Dome, especially in this case. And, just to draw us out a little bit, of course, a lot of the systems, particularly the drones, that the Iranians used are also used by Russia in its war in Ukraine. And so what we saw was some of the advantages that the Israelis have compared to the Ukrainians, which I don't think the Iranians fully accounted for. So in the first instance, you have the Israeli Arrow system, which is a anti-ballistic missile system that they use to shoot down some of the ballistic missiles. But also, Israel's allies in the region were able to help intercept drones and missiles over the rest of the Middle East before they even got close to Israel's borders, using fighter aircraft and other capabilities. And of course, this is not an advantage that Ukraine has. It doesn't have the fighter aircraft capable of carrying out this mission right now, nor does it have the geographic buffer that the rest of the Middle East gives to Israel.
And that's a really good point about the way that Israel's allies also played a key role here. I mean, had it not been for the US and indeed Jordan and the UK and others helping to shoot down some of these drones and missiles, would we be talking about a very different situation? Would the damage have been far worse?
It's certainly hard to tell, but I think it's important to kind of point out what the Allies actually did in this case. So, in the case of Jordan, there are reports that Jordanian aircraft shot down dozens of Iranian munitions over Jordanian airspace. Of course, the United States did the same with its suite of air defense systems in the Middle East, and there are reports that the British, as well as the French, also assisted in the air defense of Israel.
And just to go back to that comparison with what we're seeing in Ukraine and with Russia, the specific tactics were quite similar as well, weren't they, in terms of trying to overwhelm the air defenses?
Yeah, right. No, exactly. And I think part of why that is because the Iranians are looking at the Russian use of the Shahed drone, for example, as well as the Russian ballistic and cruise missiles against Ukraine and drawing lessons from that. So if you look at the structure of this strike package, the composition, the number of drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles, as well as how they were timed to enter Israeli airspace, there are a lot of similarities with how the Russians conduct these attacks in Ukraine. So of course, there are hundreds of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones that were launched in this attack, but they were launched in waves. So they were timed so that as the drones and cruise missiles began to enter Israeli airspace, they would distract the Israeli air defenses and the ballistic missiles would actually get through. So as you're looking at this strike package, the ballistic missiles are the component that Iran believed would strike home. And this is really important because that's how Russia structures a lot of its strike packages as well. But if you look at the comparison between Ukraine's success in intercepting drones and missiles the ballistic missiles specifically, compare that with Israel's success, it's night and day. So the Ukrainians average about a 16% intercept rate on ballistic missiles. The Israeli intercept rate on Saturday was over 90%. So while the Iranians were learning this lesson from the Russians in Ukraine, they probably calculated that yes, the Israeli air defenses are going to be more successful than Ukraine's, but I doubt that they expected that Israel's air defense structure would be just as effective as it actually ended up being. Again, this goes home and really drives home the point about Ukraine and some of the systems that of course the Ukrainians need in their fight.
Surely also one of the other key differences is that Israel was pretty much as prepared for this attack as you can be through intelligence briefings, through some pretty overt warnings from Iran.
Sure, although I don't think that the warnings are necessarily as important as they're being drawn out to be, in fact. I say that because there are a couple things on the Israeli side for context that need to be kept in mind. The first, Israel is already on a war footing. It's taking rocket fire, drone fire across its borders nearly every day. Its air defenses are already on high alert. Iran's warnings aren't really going to change that. Of course, it takes Israel faces ballistic missile and cruise missile fire from the Houthis as well on a pretty regular basis. Now, I think in terms of the Iranian telegraphing, it tried to create a tactical surprise by injecting uncertainty on when this strike would actually occur. But the Israelis were prepared. The Israelis knew that there would probably be some strike coming, given that they killed such a high level IRGC commander on April 1st. But also, like I said, they're on a war footing. And so I don't think the telegraphing of this attack, the warning of this attack, is actually as important to its success, to the air defense success, as some are putting out.
You mentioned the original Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Let's just rewind to there. What do you think Israel's motivation was with that strike?
Sure. So the commander that they killed was a very high level IRGC officer. He led the IRGC effort across Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And he was actually one of the only non-Lebanese members of the Lebanese Hezbollah Shura Council and its Jihad Council, which is really important. It shows the role that individual played in Lebanese Hezbollah. Now, of course, I think one of the important items for us to keep in mind is how Iran is using Syria rather to bring in weapons in other systems to Lebanese Hezbollah. Israel has been hitting these shipments as they come through Syria for months now, and of course, the strike on April 1st was part of this effort as well to degrade Iran's ability to support its partner in Lebanon, Lebanese Hezbollah.
Just on that, I was speaking on Frontline only last week to Roger Boyes, who's the Times diplomatic editor, and he made a very good point, which is that, of course, Russia essentially controls Syrian airspace. So why would it allow Israel to carry out this attack?
I'm not sure. It depends on what exactly which capabilities the Israelis used. In this case, I would be very surprised if the Israelis did not use the F-35, which is, of course, a stealth aircraft. In that case, there's a very good chance that Syria and Russia were not even necessarily aware that there were Israeli aircraft in the sky until the bombs were already falling.
And talk me through what their options for retaliation are. I mean, clearly one of them is to do nothing, and that's what many in the West are urging them to do. But if they do decide to retaliate, what are their options?
Sure. So I think there's three big options that the Israelis are probably looking at. Number one, no response. That's kind of your easy way out, for lack of a better term, when you're thinking about the U.S. alliance with Israel. The second is a significant strike targeting Iranian proxies in the region, Hezbollah, groups in Syria, groups in Iraq, groups in, obviously, the Houthis in Yemen. And then the third option is a attack within Iran itself. This is the most challenging for logistical reasons. It is also the most politically challenging with the U.S.-Israel alliance and Israel's relationship with the West at large. But I think that of those three, the latter two seem to be more likely right now, given what we're seeing come out in the form of leaks and indeed Israeli statements.
And if Israel do pursue one of those latter two options, would it then be inevitable that Iran would respond again in turn?
It's hard to tell. I think we'd have to wait to see how the Iranians respond and what their rhetoric by their senior leaders actually points to. Because, of course, to your earlier point, Iran's senior leaders in the wake of the April 1 attack had two big information lines. The first was, we will retaliate against Israel. The second was, United States, you need to stay out of our attack against Israel.
It is an extremely dangerous moment because we're on a scale of escalation where there is a risk that you get continuing tit for tat. And that's why, everyone from Secretary Blinken downwards and outwards is encouraging Israel to now not respond any further, because the danger if they do, then Iran will respond, and you go up the cycle of escalation. So it is a potentially very dangerous moment. It is also a very unusual moment. Iran, for all their animosity towards Israel, striking or seeking to strike Israel physically in this manner from is unprecedented. So that in itself makes it very dangerous. As you know, they typically like to operate on a proxy basis through their Quds force, through Hamas, through Lebanese Hezbollah, and others. They don't typically strike using their own military forces in this way. So it's undoubtedly a very dangerous moment. That is not to say that risk of danger needs to manifest itself.
Well, let's go through events chronologically and go back to the strike that probably led to this escalation, which of course was the suspected Israeli airstrike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. First of all, do you think that was a legitimate target for the Israelis?
I think the individuals, clearly you and I don't have access to the intelligence, but if we assume that the intelligence is valid and that those IRGC leaders were involved in facilitating and supporting attacks into Israel, then they are legitimate military targets. If that intelligence is there, and as I have no reason to doubt that they weren't, because we know how the IRGC operate. We know there's lots of attacks going into Israel, and they will be being orchestrated by IRGC. So if that is the case, then they're legitimate targets. The second question is, was it appropriate, wise to strike them in the consulate in Damascus? That is a separate question. I think the jury is out on that. You would like to think the Israelis only did that because they felt there was no alternative, and they couldn't strike them at any other time safely and securely. That is perhaps a little bit surprising, but again, we don't have access to the intelligence as to whether that was the case or not. I have read, and again, I don't know, that the advice to the war cabinet was that this was absolutely fine. It wasn't out of the ordinary, and striking them in the consulate would be fine. I'm surprised nobody challenged that on the legal side or anything else to say, even if we think we're legally okay here, consulate, this is potentially problematic. And of course for Iran, it proved so. We'll circle back if I may later on to the American strike on Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, the head of the Quds of the IRGC, because there are an awful lot of parallels there. Again, on that occasion, the Iranians were very unhappy with not only that Soleimani was killed, but also the circumstances and the location. He was struck on the dual carriageway out of Baghdad airport, and the Iraqi government were not unreasonably a little bit miffed about that. So I think there's two things. Were they legitimate targets? Yes, it would appear so. Was it wise to strike them in the consulate? Hard to know, but that's quite a tough decision to take. Yeah. So we've had a couple of indicators, haven't we? So the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force, General Halevi, yesterday said that Iran will be met with a response. I thought that was interesting. Will be met with a response. Pretty vague. It wasn't, we're going to come down with, hell and damnation. It was with a response. well, of course, there's going to be some kind of response, even if it's only diplomatic. So I thought that was very interesting, moderate language. I think some people have overinterpreted that means that there's going to be strikes. Maybe there are, but I thought General Levy's language left everything on the table. Because, America, Britain, Arab nations will all be trying to just kind of put a lid on this. Then the cabinet have more recently said that they'll respond in a, quote, manner and time of our choosing. Again, very, very vague. So thing one, I hope both of those things point to the fact that the cabinet have not made precipitous decisions about an escalatory response, and that this gives time for cool heads to prevail and diplomatic conversations to take place. Again, this is where London's embassy in Tehran is useful. And as I say, the Americans and others will be messaging very, very carefully. So, so what at a minimum, what happens is, not very much. There's some messaging, and just the whole thing just quietly eases away. Israel takes the win in terms of we've got greater unified support around us now than before, and probably then doubles down in terms of its efforts against Iranian proxies, Lebanese Hezbollah and others. I think that's an option. I would hope it'll be towards that end of the spectrum, but it's just really hard to tell. Israel, Netanyahu has his own electorate to satisfy. They've just suffered. We shouldn't underestimate the scale of the attack that was launched against them. The fact they defeated it so categorically doesn't change the fact that it was launched against them, and they may feel they have to respond. So if they do, what's that look like? Well, at its, there's speculation about, do they go after Iran's nuclear program? I mean, they've of course tried that in the past through all sorts of means, cyber, through assassinations, et al. I mean, that's certainly, that's an option. I think it's quite an extreme option, and I don't think it feels entirely germane to what's going on now. Going after Iran's nuclear program is very difficult. It's very heavily dispersed. It's deep underground. It's very hard to strike. And we have to remember Israel, meanwhile, are fighting a war in Gaza and on other fronts. And then they've got to somehow pull together this huge package to go to Iran. They've got finite capacity. So I think if it was a military response into Iran, it would be a more limited response that they felt, allows honor to be seen to be done, and that scores are even. By which I might mean, some kind of airstrike package against Iranian military targets, an air base or something. But hey, look, we're speculating. The problem with war with use of force is you get in, as I said earlier, to the kind of law of unintended consequences. And so one side conducts an act, a strike of some kind, a use of force, and it does so, it hopes, with a deterrent purpose. But of course, the person receiving the strike, the act, will receive it and make their own judgments. And, so we used to talk about, your kind of escalation, de-escalation calculus, and what you're constantly seeking to do when you carry out an act is to try and increase the jeopardy for the other side in responding. And you are also always trying to offer them what the Americans would call off-ramps. The opportunity to then de-escalate. Okay, kind of enough's enough. Kind of, I think we're all good, aren't we? Let's just kind of bring the temperature back down again. But you don't know that's going to happen. I mean, look at the history of how World War I started. It was miscalculation after miscalculation. Nobody kind of thought they were about to go into the Great War. the law of events took over. So as soon as you use force, you are opening up the opportunity for that to happen. So is there a danger of a wider escalation to regional conflict, drawing in America and others? Of course there is. That is a possibility. Do I think it's likely? I actually don't, because Iran, for all what we may say about them, they are typically a relatively rational actor. They were around Soleimani. I think they are in how they've acted since the October the 7th attack. They've been rational. They've been considered. They've been moderated in how they've been kind of irritating Israel, but no more. That's all rational. Israel, of course, feels existentially threatened. They always do by Iran, and Iran have just used military force against them. So there is a danger they will respond. But Israel know that they do need American support here, and the more they go toe to toe with Iran, the more they need American support. So I think America holds quite an important trump card here, probably more so than they do about what's going on in Gaza. So is there a risk? Yes. As soon as you start using force and throwing missiles around, there is a danger of escalation. Am I glass half empty or full? I'm glass half full. That there may be a few more plays in this, but I think that this will find a balance.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.
Our main goal was, this is what you hear from Tehran, was to hit the airport in the Negev desert from which the attack on Damascus was launched. And this is exactly where some of the missiles went through. Now, some would argue these missiles went through the Arrow and Iron Dome system because they were going somewhere where they wouldn't do any harm. The Iranian side would say this was a significant message to send, and if we want, next time we wouldn't give you enough time ahead of our attack and we could do more harm. So we have victory speeches on both sides, if you will.
And in terms of the response we've seen from Iran and this attack that they launched over the weekend on Israel itself, what were their calculations when they were deciding how to respond?
I believe it is fair to say that Iran wanted to do something that it had never done before and to do something people wouldn't expect. So I would also consider myself someone who watches Iran for quite some time, and I also didn't expect an attack like that happening. Coming from Iranian territory, also the sheer scope of missiles and drones being launched. Iran wanted to do something that is unprecedented. At the same time, and that's the continuity of similar things Iran has done in the past, Iran wanted to make sure that nothing big happens in terms of casualties or actual lives being taken, similar to the retaliatory attack to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani that you just mentioned. So here we saw a mix of breaking out of previous behavioral patterns in such circumstances, while at the same time some continuity.
And will they judge the operation to have been a success? I mean, in Israel, they're viewing it almost as a success because of the success of the Iron Dome in preventing too much damage. Will Iran look at it and think, actually, we would have wanted to have sustained more damage on Israel?
Look, James, the interesting thing is that there is a beauty in what you just said. I mean, beauty sounds a bit too euphemistic. Let's say a silver lining in what happened. And that is that the Israeli side can claim victory for its defense capabilities. And they are doing that, as you just outlined. And the Iranian side are celebrating this as a huge success in saying this was just something that happened with us giving them more than 10 days to prepare for our attack. First. Second, what our main goal was, this is what you hear from Tehran, was to hit the airport in the Negev desert from which the attack on Damascus was launched. And this is exactly where some of the missiles went through. Now, some would argue these missiles went through the Arrow and Iron Dome system because they were going somewhere where they wouldn't do any harm. The Iranian side would say this was a significant message to send, and if we want, next time we wouldn't give you enough time ahead of our attack and we could do more harm. So we have victory speeches on both sides, if you will.
And give me a sense, if you can, Adnan, on what Iran's military capabilities are at the moment. I mean, had they wished to sustain more damage to Israel, what could they do?
To me, that's honestly that's a question mark as well, and I would overstretch my, let's say, knowledge if I were to tell you what exactly Iran could do. At this moment, I think it is fair to say that Iran knew that, as the Israeli media stated and as officials stated, 99% of those things that were launched would be intercepted. It's difficult for me to assess if in any scenario that could be different. So I would leave that to military experts.
Does Iran want escalation at this point?
Certainly not. And the reason for that is that Iran's situation back at home is not such that either the population nor the state of the economy would be making Iran strong enough, or would make Iran strong enough for a regional escalation in which it would be dragged in. So I think Iran's goal, regardless of whether they achieve it or not, but Iran's goal with this operation was to de-escalate while escalating, to somehow seek something which is a bit of a mini shock and awe, if you will, and in one way or another show, stop messing with us, and then nothing more will happen. Whether that is accepted in the region, whether that is accepted in Israel or the US, we obviously don't know. At this point, it seems as if in the US that is accepted for things to now really calm down. On the Israeli side, I don't know. That this would have to be answered by those who know better than me about Israeli politics.
Well, that's the crucial question now. We wait to see what Israel does next. I mean, let's say Israel did launch an attack, and we can talk in a moment about what those options are. But let's say it launched an attack on Iran now in the coming days and weeks. Would Iran then feel duty bound to respond again in turn? And does the risk of escalation come from that?
Yeah, I mean, they're vowing basically to do so. They're already saying this. It would just take seconds for us to retaliate if there was an Israeli attack on our soil. And here I go back to the point that Iran is breaking out of formerly known behavioral patterns. If you had asked me like 8 months ago, I would say no, Iran would not retaliate if there was to be an Israeli attack on Iranian soil. Now I'm not so sure. We have to say that the red lines that may have existed in a tacit agreement between both countries have been pushed significantly farther. And if now attacking Israeli territory without doing harm can be matched by attacking Iranian territory without doing harm, then that possibly can make us see a scenario in which Israel strikes something in Iran without Iran feeling the need to respond. If Iranians get killed, regardless of military personnel or civilians, that's probably a different story then.
It's really interesting, Adnan, what you just said there about, Iran now is maybe in a different position. Its thinking is different from 8 months ago. Can you just expand on that? What do you mean by that?
I think this is something that has been in the making. Iran generally, when looking in its affairs with particularly, let's say, Western states or adversaries, and of course the US here is the biggest player, Iran always sought to either seek deterrence towards the US to keep the US away from doing harm to Iran. For deterrence, it had its means of asymmetric warfare, being aligned groups, the so-called non-state actors, at times called proxies. Iran has its nuclear program, which it sometimes turned to a deterrence factor, which we may see in the future again. The alternative to the deterrence bit was the diplomacy bit. And diplomacy happened in 2002 when Iran was seeking this grand bargain back then with the George W. Bush administration, which was rejected. And the diplomacy bit happened throughout the JCPOA, which was also a big failure. And what this can lead up to is that we will not be able to define a good relationship with the US through diplomatic means, but we will have to scare them to some sort of grand bargain. And this can make Iran a more dangerous actor, I believe. And a new generation comes up in military and strategic circles in Iran that may be fostering this line of thought.
Of the potential Israeli responses, what would be the most inflammatory? Would it be an attack
on Iran's nuclear program?
We have to appreciate the fact that such attacks in the past have already happened. So there had been cyber attacks, there had been presumably drone attacks on nuclear sites, some sort of sabotage acts happening on the ground. Something like that has happened before. And I think any strike or operation that does some damage, but not significant damage, it's difficult to define that. But I would say if we saw damage that can be, from which Iran can recover in a matter of, I don't know, 2 weeks, 6 months, 2 years, then probably nothing will happen. If military personnel gets killed, if civilians get killed, then of course that's a huge different story, and brings us to completely new calculations.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.